I still remember the way my hands trembled that morning. My son had slid a neat stack of papers across the table, his voice careful, almost rehearsed. Mom, it's just a formality. Please sign here. The way he said it made me want to believe him. Made me want to believe that family above all else could be trusted. Before we go further, this is just the start of my true story of betrayal and resilience. Tell me, where are you watching from? I glanced at the pen between my fingers, at the space where my name would soon sit in black ink. I thought of the house my husband and I had built together, brick by brick, of the laughter in its walls. My chest tightened with unease, but I swallowed it down. Mothers aren't supposed to doubt their children. I signed, and with that single stroke of my hand, I lost everything: my home, my trust, and the life I thought I knew. So let's get into what happened after that signature, because the truth didn't come crashing down all at once. At first, life carried on as it always had. The house still looked the same from the street. Stucco walls warmed by the California sun, roses lining the walkway, the same faint creak on the front step where my husband had once tightened a loose board. It all felt steady, ordinary. I didn't think much about the documents after that morning. They disappeared into a file folder my son kept under his arm, and I let it go. I told myself it was easier to trust than to question, and I clung to that belief. After all, hadn't I spent decades being the one who gave without hesitation? A mother's job is to protect, not to suspect. But a seed of unease had been planted, and it began to grow in quiet ways. I would catch myself replaying the look on his face when I signed. The quick relief, almost like he'd been holding his breath. Why did he look that way if it was only a formality? I didn't ask. Asking meant risking an answer I wasn't ready to hear. The house itself became both a comfort and a reminder. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee even when the pot was empty, as though the mornings my husband and I shared had left an invisible trace. The den still had a dent in the armchair where he used to sit, reading the paper while I folded laundry. The bedrooms echoed with my children's laughter, the slam of doors, the music blaring when they were teenagers. This wasn't just property. It was the vessel of a lifetime. That was why I brushed off the unease. Losing this home was unimaginable, so I didn't let my mind wander there. When you've spent years building something, you assume permanence. You assume loyalty too. Weeks passed, and my son remained unusually attentive. He stopped by more often, asked if I needed groceries, offered to mow the lawn even though the gardener still came twice a month. I wanted to see these gestures as kindness, but deep down, I sensed they were cover. He was distracting me, filling the space with small courtesies so I wouldn't notice what had shifted beneath my feet. The first official letter arrived in a plain white envelope. At first glance, it looked like a bank statement. I opened it over the sink, expecting a notice about property taxes. Instead, it was addressed to someone else entirely, my son's name. My heart stumbled. I told myself it was a clerical mistake, that the county office must have confused something. I set it aside, unwilling to let panic take root. But the letters kept coming. Different companies, all addressed to him, all referencing the house. Mortgage insurance, homeowner coverage, loan processing. The pile grew thicker, and with each envelope, my stomach grew tighter. I asked him about it once cautiously, as if afraid of sounding foolish. He brushed me off with a quick laugh. Mom, you worry too much. It's all just paperwork. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the hallway wall. I thought about the word paperwork. How easy it was to dismiss life-altering things under that label. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop hearing the echo of his voice that morning. It's just a formality. By the end of the month, another change arrived. A man in a suit knocked on the door while I was trimming roses in the yard. He introduced himself as a property assessor. His clipboard shook slightly when he flipped the page, and he avoided my eyes when I asked why he was there. He told me it was routine. Routine, yet my name wasn't on his sheet. I felt my knees weaken. When he left, I stood there, gripping the shears, the thorns pressing into my palm. That was the first time I let myself say the thought aloud. Something is very, very wrong. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the drawer where I kept important papers. Birth certificates, my husband's will, the deed to the house. Or at least what I thought was the deed. My hands trembled as I sifted through the folders. The original deed was gone. In its place was a copy of the very papers I had signed weeks earlier, but this time I noticed the fine print. Lines and clauses that blurred together before now screamed at me. Transfer of ownership, joint liability, collateral security. My chest tightened as though someone had cinched a belt around my ribs. I had signed away the rights to my own home. I couldn't remember breathing as I read those words. My husband's voice echoed in my memory. His constant reminder to never sign anything without reading carefully. I had brushed him off so many times, calling him overly cautious. And now, with him gone, I had walked straight into the trap he had always warned me about. I sat there for a long time, staring at the paper until the letters blurred. Shock turned to shame. How could I have been so naive? I wanted to believe in my son's goodness so badly that I had silenced my own instincts. That silence cost me everything. When he came, by that evening, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. I smiled, offered him dinner, and tucked the papers back into the drawer. Inside, I was unraveling, but outside, I played the same role I always had. The mother who smoothed things over, who didn't make trouble, who kept the peace. But peace was already gone. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, his arms crossed as he watched me. There was no anger in his eyes, only sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from seeing someone you love lose their way. When I woke, the ache of his absence cut deeper than ever. I knew then that what had happened was bigger than one bad decision. It was the culmination of years of believing that love meant trust without question. It was the habit of putting everyone else's needs above my own. And it was the first step in a battle I hadn't even realized I was entering. The papers were signed, the trap was set, and though I didn't know it yet, the fight for my home and my sense of self had only just begun. Looking back now, I realized that the house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was my life's canvas. Every corner carried a memory, and every detail held the weight of choices my husband and I made together. That's why the loss was so unbearable. To explain what it meant, I have to tell you how it came to be. The house wasn't ours from the beginning. When my husband and I first married, we lived in a small rental above a hardware store. The ceilings were low, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the heater rattled in winter. But we didn't care. We were young, working long hours, and dreaming of something bigger. On Saturday nights, we would walk through neighborhoods where houses sat behind picket fences, pointing at the ones we wished could be ours someday. Those walks planted the seed for what became the home I would one day almost lose. My husband worked in construction, and I worked part-time at a local library while raising our children. We saved every dollar we could. Vacations were rare. New clothes were bought only when necessary, and every birthday party was carefully budgeted. The children sometimes complained about not having what their friends did, but we always told them, "We're building something for the future." And we meant it. It took us nearly 15 years to gather enough for a down payment. When we finally signed the purchase papers, I remember feeling both terrified and proud. The house wasn't glamorous. It needed repairs, the backyard was overgrown, and the kitchen was outdated. But to us, it was perfect. It was ours. My husband promised that every nail he drove in, every wall he painted would be done with love. And he kept that promise. Over time, the house transformed. He built shelves in the living room for my books. He replaced the cracked tiles in the bathroom himself, grumbling the whole time but smiling when it was done. I planted roses in the front yard and watched them bloom year after year. The children left their marks too. Crayon drawings hidden behind wallpaper, scratches on the hallway floor from roller skates, initials carved into the wood of the old oak tree out back. By the time we finished paying off the mortgage, the house had grown into more than property. It was a legacy. It stood as proof of sacrifice, determination, and love. Friends would come over and admire the improvements, but I always saw the sweat behind the paint, and the late nights behind the polished wood. Every upgrade carried a story. When my husband passed away, the house became even more important. It wasn't just shelter. It was the last physical link to him. His tools were still in the garage. His handwriting lingered on scraps of paper with measurements for projects he never got to finish. Some mornings I would sit on the porch, close my eyes, and almost hear him whistling as he worked in the yard. The home kept him alive for me. That was why the betrayal cut so deep. Losing the house wasn't only financial, it was like losing him all over again. It was as if everything we had poured into that space, every sacrifice was erased with the stroke of my pen. But I didn't see it right away. At first, when the letters began to come in my son's name, I reminded myself of the years of history inside those walls. I told myself, this house has survived storms, repairs, even death. It will survive this too. I clung to that belief because the alternative, that I had handed it over, was too heavy to face. I walked through the rooms almost as though they were sacred. The kitchen table still bore faint rings from coffee cups my husband forgot to use coasters for. The hallway was dotted with framed photos. School graduations, Christmas mornings, family barbecues. Even the garage smelled of him. Sawdust, oil, and the faint tang of metal. If I pressed my hand against the workbench, I could still see the grooves where his tools had worn into the wood. I remember one afternoon, weeks after signing, I sat in the living room surrounded by silence. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the rug. I thought about the day we brought that rug home, bought on clearance after months of saving. My son, then only 10, had helped roll it out, his small hands gripping the corners. He was proud to help us make the house beautiful. That same boy now held the papers that claimed it. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Neighbors often reminded me how lucky I was to own such a valuable home in California, especially after property values soared. They would say, "That house must be worth millions by now." And I would nod, never admitting the panic that gripped me at the thought of losing it. For them, it was an asset. For me, it was my heart. Every detail in that home was a chapter in my life. The crack in the dining room wall was from the Northridge earthquake. The back patio was where my husband grilled steaks every 4th of July. The upstairs bathroom still had faint water stains from when the kids overflowed the tub trying to make a bubble bath lake. These weren't flaws. They were reminders that we had lived fully within those walls. I know now that part of why I trusted my son so easily was because I couldn't imagine him jeopardizing something so sacred. Surely he understood the history here. Surely he valued it as I did. That's what I thought. But I was wrong. The house stood proud, worth $3 million on the market, but priceless to me. Every day I woke up inside it, I felt both gratitude and fear. Gratitude for the memories. Fear that the ground beneath me was shifting, and I might one day wake up without it. That fear grew stronger with every envelope that arrived. Each letter was like a shadow creeping closer. Yet I held on to the backstory of the home as if remembering its origin would somehow protect it. I thought about my husband working overtime to save enough for the down payment. I thought about my own sacrifices, skipping vacations, wearing the same coat year after year, saying no to luxuries just so we could pay it off. We had earned this place. It wasn't handed to us, and that's why losing it felt unthinkable. Because if we could build this once, maybe I could hold on to it still. At least, that's what I told myself then. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It began with small signs, things I tried to dismiss at first, until they piled up into something I couldn't ignore. The first real jolt came when I received a letter stamped in bold red. Notice of default. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the words, my hands shaking. The letter wasn't addressed to me, it carried my son's name, but the property description left no doubt. It was this house. My house. I called him immediately, my voice trembling. He answered casually as though nothing was wrong. "Mom, don't worry about that. It's just standard paperwork when you refinance. They send those automatically." I wanted to believe him, but the word default clung to me like a weight. I had lived long enough to know words like that weren't meaningless. Still, I let it go because believing him was easier than facing the truth. Not long after, men in suits began showing up at the door. They spoke quickly, asked for my son, and when I said he wasn't home, they left envelopes behind. Each one carried more legal jargon, more warnings, more numbers that made my stomach twist. When I confronted him again, he sighed like I was being dramatic. Mom, you don't understand how these things work. I'm handling it. But I did understand. I understood that I was being pushed to the sidelines in my own home. Decisions were being made, contracts signed, and my signature, the one I had given so easily, was being used against me. The worst moment came the day a woman knocked on the door and introduced herself as a representative from a bank. She asked if I was aware that the property was listed as collateral on a large loan. My knees nearly buckled. I told her there must be a mistake. She looked at me with pity and handed me a copy of the document. My name was right there, printed beside my son's, binding me to a debt I had never agreed to take on. That night I sat in the living room, lights off, staring at the walls. The house looked the same, but it no longer felt safe. It felt like someone had broken in and stolen something vital, yet I had handed them the key myself. The betrayal pressed down on me harder than any financial threat. My own child had used my trust as a weapon. Conversations with him grew colder. When I asked questions, he grew defensive, raising his voice, telling me I didn't understand modern finance. He said I was overreacting, that I should just relax and let him take care of things. But I wasn't blind. Bills stacked higher, calls came more frequently, and the word foreclosure began to appear in black ink across official letters. The night I finally broke, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes in front of me. I opened them one by one, my heart racing faster each time. Past due notices, warnings, a sheriff's sale notice scheduled months ahead. The house, the very place my husband and I built together, was slipping through my fingers. When my son came by later that evening, I confronted him directly. I held up the foreclosure notice and asked him to explain. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw clenched. Then he said words I'll never forget. Mom, it's too late to fix it. You wouldn't understand. Too late. That was when the reality hit me in full. I had lost my home, not in some distant, hypothetical way, not in a nightmare I could wake from. It was real, written in ink, stamped with official seals. For days after, I walked through the rooms as if memorizing them. I ran my hands along the walls, touched the doorknobs, opened closets just to see the familiar spaces. I felt like I was saying goodbye to everything I loved. Friends noticed I was quieter. A neighbor stopped me once while I was watering the roses and asked if I was all right. I smiled and lied, saying I was fine, just tired. How could I tell her that the house she admired, the one she always said was so beautiful, wasn't mine anymore? I couldn't even bring myself to tell my daughter. She lived out of state, and I didn't want her to see me as foolish, weak, or gullible. So I carried the weight alone, but carrying it alone only deepened the shame. At night, I sat awake replaying every moment. The morning I signed the papers, the flicker of relief on my son's face, the excuses he gave me. I thought about my husband's warnings, his insistence on caution. I had ignored him, and now I had betrayed both his memory and myself. The day the official foreclosure notice arrived, I couldn't hold back the tears. It stated in cold legal language that the property was no longer mine. $3 million in value, decades of memories, gone with a signature I had thought was harmless. I placed the notice on the counter and sat in silence for hours. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, and outside, children rode bicycles past the house as if nothing had changed, but everything had. That was the lowest point. To realize I had been used by the very person I had loved and trusted most. To realize that the home my husband and I built was no longer ours. To realize that everything I had sacrificed could vanish in an instant. It wasn't just the house that was unraveling. It was me. I stopped cooking meals, stopped tending the roses, stopped answering the phone. Shame swallowed me whole. Each envelope that arrived felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I thought I had secured. I told myself there was nothing left to do, that the fight was over before it even began. But somewhere deep down, a spark remained. A whisper, faint but steady, telling me that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't finished yet. After the foreclosure notice arrived, the house seemed to grow quieter. Or maybe it was me who grew quieter, withdrawing into myself. I stopped answering calls from friends. I let the roses in the front yard wilt. Even the television stayed dark most evenings. Silence felt safer than having to explain the truth to anyone. The days blurred together. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, staring at the papers stacked in front of me. Every page carried a reminder of what I had lost, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. It was as though holding onto the evidence kept me connected to the life that was slipping from my hands. Neighbors noticed my absence. One of them knocked on the door one afternoon to invite me to a community luncheon, something I used to enjoy. I told her I wasn't feeling well. She offered to bring food by later, but I declined. Accepting help meant admitting that I wasn't managing, and I wasn't ready to let anyone see me as helpless. Nights were the hardest. The house creaked the way it always had, but instead of comfort, it unsettled me. Every sound reminded me that these walls no longer belonged to me. I would lie awake listening to the clock tick, wondering when someone would arrive to force me out. In those long hours, I found myself thinking of my husband more than ever. I remembered the way he had been cautious about money, how he read every line of a contract before signing. "Never put your name on anything unless you've studied it," he used to say. I'd laugh and tease him for being too serious, but he never wavered. He believed that protecting the home meant protecting the family. His voice echoed in my mind now, and with it came a flood of regret. Why hadn't I listened more closely? Why had I brushed off his warnings as old-fashioned? If he were here, would things have been different? One night, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, staring at the oak tree in the yard. I remembered how he used to lean against it, talking to neighbors or watching the children play. The image was so clear that for a moment, I almost expected to hear his whistle drift through the evening air. Instead, all I heard was the faint hum of traffic in the distance and the rustle of dry leaves. As much as it hurt, those memories also gave me a strange kind of strength. They reminded me that I hadn't built this life alone. He had trusted me to carry it forward. And somewhere inside, I still had the ability to fight. That realization didn't come in a sudden burst. It grew slowly, like a whisper building into a voice. I started by pulling out the papers again, forcing myself to read what I had signed. The words blurred at first, but then small details began to stand out. Phrases I hadn't noticed before, conditions buried deep in the fine print. I didn't fully understand them, but I could tell they mattered. I took notes in a spiral notebook, writing down questions in the margins. What did collateralized security interest actually mean? Why did one section reference repayment schedules that didn't match what my son had told me? It was like piecing together a puzzle, except this puzzle carried the weight of my future. Some evenings, I caught myself speaking aloud to my husband as if he were there. "You always told me to read carefully," I would say, flipping another page. "I'm trying now. I just wish you could explain this to me." The loneliness was sharp, but talking into the empty room gave me comfort. It made me feel less invisible, less foolish for caring so deeply about something everyone else seemed to reduce to money and paperwork. At one point, I thought about calling my daughter. She had always been practical, sharp with details, someone who could have guided me through the legal language, but shame stopped me. I couldn't bear the idea of her voice on the phone saying, "Mom, how could you let this happen?" So I kept the burden to myself. But isolation has a way of sharpening clarity. In the silence, without distractions, I began to see things more plainly. My son's reassurances no longer sounded convincing in my memory. They sounded calculated. Every gesture of kindness he'd shown after I signed now looked different, like smoke meant to hide a fire. The anger started to replace the shame. Anger at him, yes, but also at myself. I had always believed that being a good mother meant giving unconditionally, trusting without question. Now I realized that blind trust had left me exposed. Love didn't mean erasing boundaries. Love without boundaries was how I ended up here, sitting in a house that no longer belonged to me. One morning, after another restless night, I found myself back at the table with the documents spread out again. This time, I noticed a detail I had overlooked before. Buried. In the fine print was a clause that didn't make sense. It referenced an ownership transfer contingent on conditions that hadn't yet been met. I didn't know the full meaning, but it was enough to spark a thought. Maybe this wasn't as final as I believed. It was like a tiny crack in the wall of despair. Small, almost invisible, but there. And once I saw it, I couldn't ignore it. That day, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let silence swallow me whole anymore. I would find someone who could explain what these papers meant. I didn't know yet who that would be or how I would pay for help, but I knew I had to try. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't shame or grief. It was resolve. Quiet, fragile, but real. That morning when I spotted the clause I hadn't seen before, something shifted inside me. It wasn't dramatic. Not the kind of lightning strike moment movies like to show. It was quieter, steadier, like a hand on my shoulder reminding me I wasn't powerless. I reread the section again and again, tracing each line with my finger. It said the transfer of ownership was contingent on certain obligations being met. The more I looked at it, the more I realized my son hadn't fulfilled all of them. At least, not yet. If that was true, then maybe there was still a way back. I didn't trust myself to fully understand the wording, so I decided I needed help. Not from my family, not from friends who would pity me, but from someone who could translate this confusing language into plain truth. That afternoon, I drove downtown, clutching the folder to my chest like it was oxygen. The legal office I found was small, wedged between a diner and a laundromat. A brass plate by the door bore the name of a local attorney I vaguely remembered seeing at community events. I almost turned around twice before walking in. Shame still clung to me, but desperation pushed me forward. Inside, a young receptionist looked up and asked if I had an appointment. I shook my head, explaining I needed someone to glance at some documents. To my surprise, she didn't brush me off. She asked me to wait, then disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, a man in his 60s walked out, adjusting his glasses. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Green and invited me into his office. I laid the papers on his desk and explained, haltingly, what had happened. My voice wavered when I admitted it was my own son who had handed me the documents. Mr. Green didn't interrupt. He listened, his brow furrowing slightly as he read. After several minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "You're right to be concerned," he said. "This isn't just a refinancing agreement. It's a transfer of ownership document with collateral clauses. But look here." He pointed to the section I had noticed. "This condition wasn't met. That means the transfer isn't legally binding yet." Relief rushed through me so quickly I nearly cried. It wasn't over. Not yet. He went on to explain that I could challenge the agreement in court. It would be difficult, yes, and it would mean confronting my own child publicly, but the law was on my side. "You still have leverage," he said. "The question is whether you're willing to use it." I sat in silence, weighing his words. Confronting strangers was hard enough. Confronting my son felt unthinkable. But then I thought of my husband's warning, the one that had echoed in my mind for weeks. He hadn't just wanted me to be cautious. He wanted me to protect what we had built. Protecting it now meant facing the truth, no matter how painful. So I nodded. "I'm willing." That was the first time in weeks I felt like I had taken a step forward instead of sinking deeper. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Mr. Green helped me file the paperwork to contest the transfer. He explained each step carefully, never once making me feel foolish for not understanding the jargon. Each time I left his office, I felt lighter, as though I had put on a layer of armor. My son, however, noticed the change. When he came by and saw me sorting through documents, his tone shifted. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by sharpness. What are you doing with those? I told you to leave it to me. For the first time, I didn't back down. I signed my name. That makes it my business. The look he gave me was one I had never seen before. Anger mixed with something else, maybe fear. He muttered something under his breath and left without finishing his dinner. That was when I knew he realized I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. In the quiet afterward, I thought about the irony of it all. A single overlooked line, buried in legal jargon, had become my lifeline. My husband's constant insistence on reading everything carefully, which I had dismissed for years, now circled back like a lifeboat thrown into rough water. Chekhov's gun, people call it in literature. The idea that if a gun is hung on the wall in the first act, it must go off by the third. My gun had been that clause, sitting quietly on the page, waiting for its moment. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Court dates were scheduled. Letters from my son's lawyer arrived, cold and impersonal. Each one tried to paint me as confused, incapable, even unstable. It stung, but instead of breaking me, it hardened my resolve. I told myself that every insult, every dismissive word was proof of why I needed to stand up. I wasn't just defending a house. I was defending a lifetime of sacrifice, a marriage built on trust, and the dignity of a woman who had been overlooked for far too long. Some nights the fear still crept in. I would wake at 3 a.m, heart pounding, imagining losing everything anyway. But then I would picture my husband standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes steady. I would hear his voice. Protect what we built. That memory became my anchor. By the time the first hearing date arrived, I wasn't the same woman who had signed those papers without question. I walked into the courthouse with my head held high, my folder of documents clutched firmly in my hands. My son sat across the room, avoiding my eyes. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt like I wasn't the one on trial. He was. Walking into the courthouse that morning, I felt the weight of every decision that had brought me there. The air inside was cool and still, the kind that makes you hear your own footsteps echo. I carried the folder close to my chest, the same folder that had become both my burden and my weapon. My son was already seated at the long table across the aisle. He looked polished, wearing a suit that didn't quite hide the tension in his jaw. He glanced at me briefly, then turned away, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with his attorney. The man beside him was younger, sharp-eyed, and confident. I felt small in comparison, but Mr. Green's steady presence at my side reminded me that I wasn't alone. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My knees wobbled, but I forced myself upright. This was no longer about shame or fear, it was about truth. The proceedings began with the opposing attorney laying out their version of events. He spoke quickly, using words meant to sound final. Ownership transfer, default, obligation. He painted me as confused, implying that I hadn't understood what I signed, that I was overreacting, clinging to a home I no longer had rights to. Each sentence felt like a jab, but I stayed still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Then it was our turn. Mr. Green rose and spoke with calm authority. He explained that the transfer was incomplete because the conditions outlined in the contract had not been fulfilled. He pointed to the clause I had noticed, highlighting it clearly. He reminded the court that my signature had been obtained under the assumption of formality, not full disclosure. As he spoke, I watched the judge's face. She nodded occasionally, her eyes flicking from one document to another. My heart pounded with every pause, every question she asked. For the first time, it felt like someone in power was actually listening. When my son was called to testify, my stomach clenched. He walked to the stand confidently, but his eyes betrayed him. He avoided looking at me. His answers at first were smooth, practiced, as though he had rehearsed them. But under questioning, cracks appeared. When asked if he had fully explained the nature of the documents to me, he hesitated. That hesitation hung in the air like a heavy curtain. I couldn't stop myself from remembering the morning he handed me the papers. The way he had smiled tightly, the way he had urged me to sign quickly. Sitting there, listening to him dance around the truth, my chest burned with a mix of sorrow and anger. When it was my turn to speak, my legs trembled as I stood. The bailiff held out a Bible, and I swore to tell the truth. My voice shook at first, but once I began, the words came. I told the court about the morning I signed, about the trust I placed in my son, about how I believed him when he said it was only a formality. I spoke about my husband's warnings, my regret, and the shock of realizing I had lost not only property, but a legacy. I didn't embellish. I didn't try to sound clever. I simply told the truth, plain and steady. And in that truth, I felt stronger than I had in months. When I finished, there was silence in the room. The judge studied me for a long moment before nodding for me to return to my seat. I sank down, exhaling slowly, my hands trembling, but my spirit steadier than it had been in a long time. The rest of the proceedings blurred together, but I remember the moment the judge spoke her decision. She ruled that the transfer was not legally binding due to unmet conditions and lack of clear disclosure. She ordered further review of the financial dealings involved and placed a temporary stay on the foreclosure. It wasn't a complete victory. Not yet. But it was enough. Enough to prove that I wasn't powerless. Enough to show that my voice still mattered. My son's expression when the decision was read will stay with me forever. Shock first, then anger, then something I couldn't quite name. He left the courtroom without looking at me. Watching him walk away felt like another kind of loss, but one I was ready to face. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, the world looked different. The courthouse steps were crowded, people rushing past, but I stood still for a moment, breathing deeply. The air felt lighter, fresher, as though I had finally opened a window in a room that had been closed too long. Mr. Green patted my shoulder and told me the fight wasn't over, but I had taken the hardest step. I nodded, knowing he was right. More hearings would come, more papers, more tension. But I also knew that I was no longer hiding. That night, I walked through the house differently. I touched the walls, the furniture, the photographs, not as someone saying goodbye, but as someone reclaiming her place. For the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking in a panic. The reckoning had begun, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I finally believed I could walk it. Not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had found her strength again. So after the judge placed the stay, the days that followed felt different. I woke up without that sick rush of panic. I could breathe in the kitchen again. I could stand in the doorway of the garage and let the smell of sawdust steady me. The fight wasn't finished, but the ground beneath me finally held. Mr. Green met me twice more that week. He mapped out what came next: discovery, depositions, and a motion to void the transfer entirely. He talked to me like a partner, not a problem to manage. I kept a notebook open during every meeting, writing down plain versions of the terms I needed to understand. For the first time in months, the paperwork didn't tower over me. I had a way through it. My son did not call. I didn't reach out either. Boundaries were new to me, and they felt strange, like shoes that hadn't been broken in. Yet, every time I didn't answer his short, late-night texts, I felt a small return of control. Love and boundaries could exist together. I just had to learn how. When the bank's lawyer sent another stack of filings, Mr. Green smiled a little and said, "They're trying to wear you down." I told him they would have to try harder. We filed our own motion that week, attaching the clause he'd circled during our first meeting and a timeline showing the conditions that were never met. The documents no longer read like a foreign language. They read like a story, and I knew the beginning, middle, and end. News of the case reached my daughter. She called from out of state and said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I started to apologize, then stopped. "Because I was embarrassed," I said. "Because I didn't want you to see me only as the mistake I made." She was quiet for a breath. Then she said, "You're not a mistake. You're my mother. I'm flying in." She arrived with a carry-on, a stack of color-coded tabs, and the kind of focus you only see when someone you love is in trouble. We sat at the dining table, the same table where the first letter had scared me into silence, and we made a plan. If I lost the house, I would not lose myself. If I kept it, I would not keep the old patterns that had left me unprotected. The next hearing felt different. The courtroom still held the same stillness, but I carried less fear into it. The judge asked pointed questions about disclosures, about the rush to sign, about why the conditions listed on page 7 were ignored. The bank's attorney spoke in long, careful sentences. Mr. Green replied in short ones. The truth didn't need extra words. At one point, the judge turned to me and asked, "Did you understand that you were transferring ownership?" I met her eyes. "No," I said. "I was told it was a formality. If I had understood, I would have asked for time. I would have asked for counsel. I would have said no." She nodded and moved on. Later, she issued an order. The transfer was void, the foreclosure frozen, and the case referred for review of potential misrepresentation. I didn't shout or cry. I sat very still, hands folded, while relief moved through me like warm water. I had not only been heard, I had been believed. Outside on the steps, my daughter hugged me so hard I lost my breath. Mr. Green shook my hand and said, "You did the hard part. You told the truth." Then he added, "There will be settlement talks. I'll advise you to take back title, recover fees, and document every communication going forward." I told him I would follow his advice. I also told him I would be adding my own. I would be adding a trust. We did the paperwork for that the next week. Title moved back into my name, then into a living trust with clear successor rules and protections I could explain in simple sentences. I opened a new file drawer and labeled it in thick black marker so I could always find it. I put a copy in my daughter's care, and I gave the third copy to the bank's safe deposit box. The house would never again rest on a single signature. My son texted the day after the order posted, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed, "Not today. When we do, it will be with a counselor present." He didn't reply. Weeks passed. When he finally called, his voice carried the old charm. He said he had been stressed. He said he had meant well. He didn't use the word sorry. I told him I wanted him to build a life he could be proud of. I also told him there would be consequences for choices that harmed other people. That included limiting financial contact, written agreements for any future help, and no access to my accounts or papers. In the months that followed, I rebuilt routines the foreclosure scare had blasted apart. I returned to the library as a volunteer for the literacy program. I joined a community group for seniors learning basic legal and financial skills. Women who, like me, had signed things they didn't fully grasp because someone they loved told them it was fine. We passed around highlighters and sticky notes, practicing questions you ask before you sign. We learned to say, "I need time," and "I want this in writing." And we practiced saying them out loud until they felt natural. I started tending the roses again. I replaced a few bushes that had died while I was hiding from the world. My hands toughened back up. I set a small stool by the oak so I could rest and watch the street go by. Neighbors stopped to chat again. I told more truth than I used to tell. Not every detail, just enough to be real. The money I spent on legal fees stung, but it taught me something I should have known earlier. Protection is not selfish, it's responsible. My husband had tried to teach me that when he insisted on reading every line. I used to tease him for it. Now I keep his old tape measure on the workbench where I can see it. A reminder that measuring twice before you cut is not only for wood. On a clear afternoon, I invited my daughter to help me box up some of my husband's old tools. Not to erase him, but to make room for the life I was building. As we worked, she asked if I would ever forgive my brother. I answered honestly, "I don't know yet. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a road. I'm willing to walk it, but I'm not willing to pretend I'm already there." She nodded and handed me a small wrench. We wrapped it and tucked it into a labeled container. Settlement talks came and went. We recovered fees and a modest sum for the trouble, and the record now showed exactly how the title had been mishandled. The bank issued a letter acknowledging errors in process. My son kept his distance. I kept my boundaries. Both things I learned could be true at the same time. When the first property tax bill arrived in the trust's name, I held it for a long minute before opening it. It felt plain and good. Paper that represented responsibility, not panic. I set a reminder on the calendar and paid it early. Then I made tea and walked the rooms the way I used to when grief first hollowed them out. Only this time, I didn't rush to hold on to every memory. I let the past be the past. I let the home be a home again. On the anniversary of the court order, I invited a few friends over. We ate simple food at the dining table and shared stories about wrong turns that taught us something. I didn't hide my part. I said, I signed without reading. I didn't ask questions. It cost me. Then I learned. No one judged me. A woman across the table squeezed my hand and said, Me too. Later that night, I stood on the porch and looked at the oak. The wind moved gently through the leaves. I thought about the day I first walked through this house with my husband and the years that turned it into a home. I thought about the months I almost lost it and the choice that brought me back to myself. The house mattered, yes. But what mattered more was the person I had become while fighting for it. I went inside and put the folder back in its drawer. Not because I would never need it again, but because it no longer owned me. I owned my choices now. I owned my voice. And that, more than any deed, was the inheritance I planned to pass down. If standing up for yourself after betrayal struck a chord with you, the next story will hit even deeper. It begins with what looks like a joyful family moment, then unravels into something no one expected. Follow through and watch it now. You'll see why strength sometimes comes disguised.